Michelle. So this is, as John said in the introduction, this is a talk on what we're calling Translational Computer Science. It's joint work with a colleague of mine, Manish Parashar, as he said. And if you saw the talk at Supercomputing last year, then you'll say, well, that's very similar. In fact, very similar indeed. So hopefully for most people, this will be some new material. So I'm going to, over the next hour, I didn't actually check the time. I assume we want some time for questions. But over the next little bit less than an hour, I'm going to talk to you about what we mean by translational research in general and how this applies to computer science. And I'm going to give you some examples of things that are very personal, the things that I've done over the years that turned out to be translational computer science. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why everyone isn't necessarily doing this and what the issues might be there. I'll say a little bit about the role of students, and we'll see what we can pack into the time there. Let me just find my mouse. So as I did at SC, and it's totally appropriate that I do this here, of course, the award is in honor of Ken for his impactful work over many years, and it's perhaps no accident that translational computer science means so much, not just because it's a pun on Ken's work on parallelizing compilers and translators, but more importantly, I think he epitomized the type of research that we're talking about, and hopefully it'll become clear as to why what he was doing may well have been regarded as translational CS. And why a paradigm for that's useful. So I certainly want to pay honor to Ken. I did meet him a few times. Other people obviously know him much better than that. This was the slide from that I put up at SC last year, and so this was the reason I won the award, and I am really very chuffed to have done that. So it's a huge honor, and I was very happy to accept it. Jeff Hollingsworth, who was the chair of the committee, actually said there's a slight modification on why I got the award, because I did actually manage to get to SC last year in spite of the fact that there were no flights, our borders were closed, quarantine was mandatory, and various other factors, all of which fell away just before SC, and I managed to get out of the country and back in, only to wake up about 2 weeks before I was supposed to travel and realize that my passport was in another city that I couldn't get to, because our domestic borders were still closed. So Jeff thought that, in fact, I should have got the award for navigating all of the difficulties in doing that. Let me also just give you some local content. I recently did a 100-kilometer, what's that, about 60-mile bike ride, raising money for prostate cancer, which is it's an annual ride down from Brisbane to the Gold Coast. If you look that up on Google Maps, you'll see where that is. But because of the inclement weather, they cancelled the ride. And I thought, well, I had all these people donate money on the belief that I was actually going to go and do a 100-kilometer ride. So I felt that they wouldn't be too pleased if I just said, well, it was bad weather, sorry, it's all cancelled. So I did a virtual ride. And for those of you who are cyclists, you'll know there's some very cool virtual software around. And so I did actually choose Houston. I have to say that it was the part of an Ironman ride, which was all done on the motorways. So I can't say it was particularly exciting. The most exciting part there is in that bottom picture. You can see a train went by. That was the most exciting part of, and let me tell you, 100 kilometers on a stationary bike trainer is no mean feat. But there you can see it's plotted on Strava up there, and I did actually complete that ride. So that was my introduction to Houston. I hope I'll get to see a little bit more of it over the next few days. Not on a bicycle either. Okay, so what's the background to this work? As said in the introduction, this is some work I've been doing most recently with Manish. It started in at a workshop in a chateau out the back of Lyon, sponsored by a workshop that's run every few years by Jack and Bernard, as you can see on the acknowledgement, and where a bunch of people get together and talk about stuff, right? And we typically talk about supercomputing stuff. So Manish and I got together, and I would be lying if I said that maybe a small amount of alcohol wasn't involved in this, scheming up this whole idea, but we wanted to do something and talk about the impact of computer science research. And so we, as you'll see in a moment, we coined this term translational research for computer science, and then wrote a paper on it and published that in IEEE Computer, and you can see an image of that on the top right. And if you're interested in it, please do go and look at that. We then pulled together a special issue of the Journal of Computational Science and had something like about a dozen papers from people who were doing their research this way. We ran some invited talks at SC, and there's now a new department in IEEE Computing and in Science and Engineering. So this is an ongoing story, and we're keen to get out there and talk about it. So I'm giving this talk wherever I can, and it's been quite interesting to get the feedback on this whole process. So let me give you the background, and I normally I would ask for a show of hands of who's heard of translational medicine, but I'm just going to assume that a whole stack of hands would go up at this point, because all I can see is Michelle's fixed image there. So so let's assume that people know something about translational medicine, but it's an interdisciplinary branch of biomedical research. And they talk about three pillars there. There's the bench side, the bedside, and the community. They're the three aspects of translational research that underpin translational medicine. And this is typically, so combining, in this case, multiple disciplines, multiple resources, expertise, and techniques within those pillars to promote enhancements in the prevention, diagnosis, and therapies. So medicine, of course, is the domain there. And as you'll see, if you haven't already worked it out, that what we're doing is mapping that across to the way we do research. But the difference between this and the most usual question we get is, well, how does this differ from applied research? And as you'll see in the moment, that the findings are applied in a specific phase of the research plan, not as some afterthought. So applied research, and I'll show you a slide in a moment, typically starts with something and then an applied problem, but then moves through the research to work out how to solve it. But it doesn't necessarily have a loop back to the original problem, and it doesn't necessarily apply it to that original problem during the research plan. And so what can happen is the research can finish, and then then application may occur and translation may occur, but that doesn't guarantee the success of the translation operation. So it demonstrates applicability, but in translational research, it demonstrates applicability whilst there's still a chance to do something about it. So whilst the research is actually progressing, we feed things we find out in application, typically with a community, and bring that back in and perhaps modify things as they go. So in translational medicine, the bench side is, of course, typically the laboratory where the work is done. It may be a wet lab. The bedside, of course, is the place where it's applied. And the community is the group of people who are brought in at the beginning of that research project to help with the application and measure its success. So this has become a de facto standard for a lot of medical research, and there's a debate out there about whether it's in fact too strong in medicine. There's still a role for pure research, and there's still a role for applied research, but translational research is in many cases used as the template for driving the research process. And you know, it addresses this issue of impact up front. So we spend a lot of time in research administration trying to measure the impact of our research, but translational medicine makes that much clearer because we're measuring the impact as a byproduct and a part of the original research plan itself. So what does that look like if we map that across to computer science? Then we've changed some of the names here. So instead of the bench, we talk about laboratory. There's a pretty clear mapping there from one to the other. We have changed bedside. We didn't think it was appropriate to stick with the word bedside for computer science research. So we call that locale, which is the place that it can be applied. And interestingly, in computing research, of course, that could be physical or it could be virtual. Whereas, of course, in translational medicine, it's almost always going to be a physical environment. But our locales are things that often we represent inside the machine, so that can be virtual. The community is the same. There's a one-on-one mapping between the communities. in the two. And the idea is that we bring in early users or adopters who work with us as we do the research and help us apply the technology to see how that works. And community can be an extremely broad thing, and locale can be extremely broad. So it could include public bodies that would actually help in the evaluation. And I'll come back to that in a moment when I talk about the differences between this, or some of the inhibitors to this, and why perhaps some of the other things we talk about in applied research don't necessarily guarantee translation. Okay, so it's here's our formal definition. You'll find that Manish and I are bandering this around a bit now. It's research that bridges foundational, use-inspired or applied computing with the delivery and deployment of its outcomes to a target community. So it's that last bullet point that makes it a difference between applied research and stuff which is actually translated. There's often a bidirectional interplay where delivery and deployment processes inform the research itself. So they happen as part of doing the research. You try and measure what's going on. Now, we've also coined another term going along this called accidental translationists, because it's simply the fact that a number of people, and I mentioned Ken's work earlier, but a number of people have been doing this for some time. But we call them accidental translationists, and Manish and I regard ourselves as accidental translationists because we didn't really realize what we were doing as we did it. And there was certainly no talk about this. And in fact, some of this work even predates the discussion about translational medicine. So let me just tell you about a project that I did quite a number of years ago. Perhaps embarrassed to tell you, but it's you know, over 30 years ago. This was some work between the group where I was working, the lab I was working, which is the National Science Lab, CSIRO, and the Environment Protection Agency, who were trying to evaluate the effect of pollution controls on smog. Now, I don't know whether anyone in the audience is a chemist, but smog is not just a byproduct of the precursors that come out of cars or factories or whatever else, but it's chemistry that's actually occurring in the atmosphere. And so what happens is your automobile may throw out some reactive organic compounds, it may throw out some oxides of nitrogen, and that in itself forms the base level of the pollution. But what happens in smog is that that stuff all cooks up in the atmosphere. There's ultraviolet and light that causes chemistry to actually occur. And one of the byproducts of that chemistry is ozone. And ozone is not a very nice compound because it's highly reactive, and so it actually affects the breathing passages. So what the EPA wanted to do, of course, was evaluate control strategies for the production of smog to see whether they can minimize it. But the nasty part about the chemistry is that there are certain parts of the domain in which when you increase the precursors, you can actually decrease the amount of ozone produced and vice versa. It's nonlinear chemistry. And so this means it falls squarely in the air. Well, so you can do two sorts of experiments. You can either do the experiment, but when the controls cost billions of dollars, you'd like to get the sign right. Are we making it better or worse? Or you can fall into the computational domain and do it computationally. And it turns out there's some, even back then, there was some relatively mature codes for modeling the airflows in the atmosphere and also modeling the chemistry that occurs. That's a set of nonlinear differential equations to be solved, and so it's quite time consuming. And typically this takes about 8 hours on a workstation to do one modeling scenario. What you want to do is scale the precursors, so you finish up wanting to do hundreds of runs. So we thought, well, that's pretty cool. It takes about 8 hours to do. I was working in a lab that had tens or hundreds of workstations. I said, why don't we farm it out across the workstations? Now, that might not sound like a very difficult thing to do in 2022, but in the 80s, that was fairly challenging. And we decided to do it by hand to start with. So I had a research assistant, and I said to him, I want you to launch hundreds of these simulation runs across the network, and then we'll have it all done in a couple of nights. And it turned out that this is sufficiently difficult to do even back then, well, sorry, even now, but back then, where the tools of trade were remote login and FTP for moving files around. And he basically said, if you make me do this again, I'll resign. So what ensued was something like then around about 20 years of research on how to build a system that would allow us to do that routinely. So you can see on the left a screen capture of the tool we produced, which was just for doing the photochemical pollution modeling, but in fact, what turned into to be a much more general tool that I'll talk about in just a moment. But the important thing was we were working with the community of people trying to do it at the time. And so everything that we learned from them got fed back into the tools that we were producing to do this more easily. Okay, so accidental translationists, and there are plenty of them around, are people who've been doing this but had no formal paradigm for how to do it. So the reason we're formalizing this model is so that if people do want to do it, and we're certainly not saying you shouldn't do peer research and you shouldn't do applied research, but if you do want to do it, there's now a more formal understanding of what it is, and also a more formal understanding of what the roadblocks are. So I want to spend a bit of time now talking about exemplars, and these are personal ones, but when Manish gives his talk, he injects some of his own. One of them is actually going to build directly off the example I just gave you. What that work in photochemical pollution did was spawn many years of R&D in how to build software tools that could take computations of the class of the pollution modeling, distribute them on workstations and bring the results back. And even though that sounds incredibly simple, it turns out that the biggest difference between a local computing system and a distributed one is that failures are the norm in the distributed computing system. So computations fail, networks fail, people come in and use their workstations, all sorts of things mean that it's not just a case of sending a computation out there, waiting for the result and bringing it back. Faults are the norm. And so we spend a lot of time working on tools that allow you to control the process, schedule the computations, manage failures, and the like. And so that formed a group of tools called Nimrod-G, as I'll show you another example of that in a moment. And then various versions of that do the experiment differently. For example, Nimrod-O allows you to phrase the experiment as an optimization problem. And you could say things like, please find the control strategy that minimizes ozone production or minimizes the cost of ozone. And that applies nonlinear optimization techniques. There's a version that does design of experiments. There's a version, the most general version of this is one where this turned into general scientific workflows that could be distributed across the grid. The important thing is that this has survived multiple generations of workstations, clusters, grids, most recently clouds, and as the underlying platforms have changed, we've managed to adapt the tools and do different R&D along the way. So it's really aided our understanding of high-performance computing and more importantly, distributed computing along the way. So this was one of the initial applications of Nimrod, and it came out of some collaborative work with some colleagues who had a really simple question. They were environmental scientists, and their question was, if I burned the savannah, could that affect the onset of the monsoon? So this is the northern savannah in Australia, and they want to know whether that could actually affect the weather. When they first posed the question, you might imagine there were good reasons to think that was so, but of course there was no way of actually doing the real experiment. And so again, we fell back onto simulation as the only plausible way to actually answer that scientific question. So the picture on the left is the savannah unburnt. The picture on the right is the savannah burnt. I don't know how clear that picture is on your screen, but you can make out that obviously the vegetation has been damaged. The surface is now black instead of green. The trees are no longer expirating stuff into the atmosphere. So a lot of the land surface physics changes so that you might imagine that could cause some change in the weather, but was completely unknown as to whether that in fact could happen. And so we did a computational experiment using Nimrod that distributed hundreds of simulations out across in that case, across the grid, the wide area distributed grid, and brought the results back again. And if you're interested in the outcomes, science outcomes, the answer is that if you burn the savannah long and hard enough at the right time of the year, or you could view that as the wrong time of the year, you can actually affect the onset of the monsoon. I guess in these days of global warming, we understand that local effects can have more dramatic global effects. But at the time, this was still an open question as to whether a local effect like changing the land surface physics there could actually affect something like when the monsoon would arrive. So this was published in a science journal and attracted a fair amount of discussion around the science in its own right. But this just wasn't a bunch of computer scientists helping environmental scientists do their stuff, because along the way, we learned an enormous amount about how to build our software tools. So we shipped data across the international boundaries over the international networks. Turns out no one had actually moved that much data around before between Australia and, in fact, this case, across the Pacific Rim. And so the way you move data changed the way we built our tools. You can see on the bottom trace, possibly see that there's a region here where nothing was happening. This is the number of concurrent activities, and this is where nothing's happening. And that's a region where we took our middleware down and changed it and then relaunched or launched the experiment picking up from where we were. So whilst the science is still coming in across these early stages, we discovered that our scheduling algorithm wasn't working. So we modified the scheduling algorithm and then relaunched the tool at some later stage. And then actually you can see there's a slightly better utilization of the underlying machines. So the results were feeding back into the computer science as we were going. And we finished up doing things, and the outputs there were the artifact itself, plus writing papers on, for example, how to move data across these large virtual networks. So there are outcomes both in the science as a result of holding the tool together, if you will, with rubber bands and the like, keeping it going to get enough science out of it, but in the meantime, improving the computer science and publishing the computer science as first-class artifacts. Here's another example of some work we did in the, this was in the 90s, with a group at Argonne National Labs with Ian Foster, who, by the way, happens to be this year's Ken Kennedy Award. So I'm sure he'll come out and give a talk some stage in the next year. What they were doing there was parallelizing the model of a climate model, in this case of MM5, and putting it onto the parallel machines at Argonne. And so there were outcomes there also in the actual computer modeling of climate and weather and how to parallelize that. So there are outcomes in the domain. But in the process of doing the port, they discovered that the codes were not producing exactly the same answers. And so what you see on this slide is actually a visualization of the differences between two versions of the code, between MM5 and NPMM, running on two different machines concurrently. And what you're looking at actually in the top right picture there is an isosurface of error between the temperature variables in the two models. So they're both three-dimensional data structures holding temperature, but what you're not seeing is not the temperature itself, but an isosurface of error between the two. So the codes aren't producing the same answers. And this is a visualization of why. In the bottom, what you actually see is a time-varying video of that process. So the isosurfaces are being drawn there in time steps. And as the time steps advancing, you can see those error surfaces actually growing bigger. Now, here's the thing. I showed this to a friend who was a climate modeler, but didn't have access to the codes. And he said, well, you don't have one error there. I think you have two errors. And the reason he can make that statement was that these are time-stepping codes. And so in each time step, you're evolving the next state of the system. And in looking at the video, he said to me, I can see an error surface evolving at the top of the atmosphere. And it's not coming from the bottom, right? It can't get from the bottom of the atmosphere to the top of the atmosphere in one time step. And so he took a guess and he said, I'd say that you've got different physics in those parts of the space, and you've got planetary boundary layer physics at the bottom, and you've got radiation code at the top. So they're almost certainly happening in those parts of the computation. Now, this is without looking at the code, just looking at a scientific visualization. And it turned out that there were, in fact, two divergences between them. One of them is in this planetary boundary layer physics at the bottom. That's this region at the bottom. And the long wave radiation code that's affecting the upper atmosphere was where the other error was. And there were two completely different errors merged into this parallelization step. So this told us that, well, number one, it told us that scientific visualization of these things can be incredibly powerful. But it also taught us a lot about how to build debuggers. Because what we then proceeded to do was build a debugging system, and you're not supposed to read the schematic on the left, but what turned out to be over some years, a very powerful, scalable debugging platform. Now, we thought our parallel debugging platform was scalable when we started. We thought, oh, that'll go to tens of cores. Well, it didn't. It maxed out, you know, at about tens of cores. And we finished up with a system now that if you buy a Cray, you actually get a debugger, which has come from my lab. Cray call it their comparative debugger. And that's something that runs on hundreds of thousands of cores. So to get from something that scales to small units of cores up to hundreds of thousands, it turns out you've got to change the way you build your architecture and change the way the debugger works. And so what's evolved is actually quite a sophisticated debug architecture on the left. Okay, so again, outputs in the science domain, outputs in the computer science domain. I'm just going to quickly move through some exemplars of colleagues of mine, probably colleagues of yours, to show you that there are other accidental translationists out there. This is some work from Ava Dielman from ISI at University of Southern California, who has also been working on scientific workflow systems over many years, and doing not dissimilar research from some of the Nimrod research. But I don't know how many people in the audience know this, but Pegasus was actually used as the engine for computing the gravity wave work from the LIGO experiments, and in fact underpinned the computations that led to the visualizations of the gravity wave. So again, similar story of doing real world research in computer science with an application domain and learning the things that don't work about your computer science and feeding it back into that process and doing better research. So that's one example. I'll just move through them fairly quickly. This is some work from another colleague of mine, Ilke Altentas from University of San Diego, California, San Diego, and San Diego Supercomputing Center, where they've been doing work, as it turns out, also in scientific workflows, but used for computational modeling of wildfires. This is a project called Wi-Fi, in which advanced computational models, weather models, data from the field, IoT, is being integrated into fairly sophisticated real-time workflows that are then used in wildfire mitigation. So again, equally applied and equally relevant, and good computer science coming out of it. Here's some work from Ian Foster and Carl Kesselman, again, work that has been applied in practice. And so this is the Globus toolkit, which many of you may be aware of. Globus as a service has been available for some time. GridFTP is now, or Globus Online, is now the dominant method for moving data between large supercomputing centers. Now, it didn't start out, you know, that way. It started out as, again, an applied computer science project to work out how to do it. And in the process of deployment and execution and use, fed back in such that it's a fairly sophisticated platform as a service. Okay, so I guess if I was in the room, normally I'd ask for if there's any obvious questions coming out, but we'll hold them. And John, I assume the audience is still mildly awake, so you can feedback if that's not the case. But let me just switch gears and talk a little bit about what I started out saying as to why this differs from a traditional computer science research pipeline. So here's a schematic of what a traditional applied computer science workflow or pipeline might look like. So we'll take some problem that is a real world problem. We may abstract it and redefine it slightly so we've got something more workable. and produce a problem definition. And then we go through a process of proposing solutions. If it's an experimental computer science approach, we'll prototype them, we'll apply them, and we'll feed it back in and see whether it's worked. And at the end of the story, there will be a number of outputs. Of course, papers being a dominant one over many years, is people writing papers about what they've done. Increasingly, people are also publishing the code. So if you think about artifacts, there may be code coming out of it, and there may also be commercialization. The big difference when we move to a translational computer science paradigm is that we add in this additional red arrow in which a community is engaged. And the important thing is that the community is engaged from the beginning of the research project or very early on in the research project. So as opposed to it being an afterthought that you did some applied research, it seemed to work on your abstract version of the problem, and then you write a paper about it, and then someone might pick it up, someone might commercialize it. The difference here is that the community is engaged from day one, and that feeds back into a redefinition in many cases, or certainly feeds back into changing the approaches that we've adopted. So if you get nothing else out of this lecture, just try and remember that picture is the one of saying we have an additional feedback loop and additional partner in the process. So why hasn't everybody been doing it? You know, if that's all it is, we've got these accidental translationists. Why has this not been so widely adopted? And Manish, I stood back and had a think about what is it that's in fact holding it back, and here are the things we came up with, and I'll drill down on each of these in a little bit more detail. First of all, that we think it's often confused with commercialization. People are using open source, so code is getting out there. What's the problem? Funding agencies don't typically provide support for translation. PhD programs don't allocate time for translation. Traditional publication venues and metrics don't value translation. And there's been a lack of exemplars. So that's some half dozen. When we wrote our special issue of the Journal of Computational Science, we evaluated these back against the submissions that we had of about a dozen. And these are the ones we pulled out as the things we think are actually holding. This is the reason that things are holding it back. Now, people are still doing it, and so they're mitigating these using various techniques, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So first of all, translation is not commercialization. Commercialization may be a form of translation, and it may happen that way, but too often it's after the research is done that you may or may not commercialize the thing and get feedback from the market, which is a long way downstream of the research process itself. So the translation process in commercialization is more of an accident than a designed-in feature of the research. And it's often hard to get the feedback from that community that in that case happens to be customers back into the research to change the way things happen. The other thing is that commercialization implies a financial angle that actually has little to do with the research. So you could imagine doing public good research, which is maybe translated through a museum or some not-for-profit. And so you're not commercializing it per se, but you're still translating it and distributing it. So that confusion, sometimes people say, well, I'm not going to do commercialization, so therefore I'm not going to do translation, and they're not the same thing. The second issue is one of use of open source, and again, there's this belief that if you get your software out there, that it's being translated. Well, it may, or it may not, and it may not feed back into the research that delivered it. So again, it's more of a unidirectional pipeline that says that I'm publishing my papers and I'm publishing my code, and that's a good thing to do. But that doesn't mean that anybody who picks up that code necessarily feeds it back into the research that you're doing. Now, they may improve on it. And so there may be some sort of serial use of this workflow one after another, but it doesn't give you the opportunity necessarily to pull it back in. Now, we use open source repositories and the like in many translational projects. So it's a useful tool, but just because you put something in a repository didn't mean that you were able to do translational research. So it's a good thing, but not necessarily the same. Now, this is probably the biggest, and people obviously focus on this, is that funding bodies, by and large, and things are changing slowly, but by and large, funding bodies don't typically support translation. The evaluation criteria, and I've sat on our national evaluation panels for research grants, typically focus on how good the research is and what are you going to do with it in terms of publication. And in fact, the track record of the CIs, or PIs as you call them here, is often the driving thing. How many papers did they write and where did they publish them? Often drives what the funding body does when it's choosing that project to support. But translation is almost never highlighted in the grant because there's usually no box to tick to say, are they translating it? It's going to be a whole stack of other metrics about how good the research project is and whether it's in fact going to be funded that don't value translation. A budget that you, and so that over and above the fact that you may not get it funded, is the whole issue of, even if it was to be supported because it's good research, if you put in a budget item to say, I want to include a community trial and it's going to cost this much, more often than not, that even if the project was going to get up, the bit that would get cut out is the bit to do the community trial, because that costs extra and we're always trying to prune the budgets, and people will say, well, okay, but it's not core to the research. Let's see if we can pull that stuff. If you want to involve PhD students in the translation process, this becomes difficult because PhD timelines over here are a little bit longer, but in Australia, they're 3 to 3.5 years. You have to have come up with your good idea, done the R&D on it, written it up, hopefully published some papers along the way, and then get out. And so most PhD timelines are too tight to allow someone to really work with a community and integrate feedback back into the PhD itself. And since PhDs are often the workhorse of a lot of our research labs, the shorter PhD timelines don't typically support translation. And so that can be another impediment. Another problem is that traditional publication venues don't value translation. So if you spent, half your time translating something, but only got 1 or 2 tier 1 journal publications, how's that going to affect your promotion chances? How's it going to affect the chance of getting another grant? Unfortunately, those metrics are the things that are in fact fed back in to drive the whole research esteem and research excellence process. Many translational research projects are interdisciplinary, so the outcomes, as I showed you some examples before, may be published in other places, which may not align well with our own journal's primary foci. And interestingly, most journals don't publish failures. If you try and write a paper about what didn't work, the odds are you wouldn't get that published. This is discussed a bit amongst those communities, but we don't tend to publish the things that don't work. We always write a paper that says, well, I got these great algorithms and I publish those. Sometimes knowing about failure in a project is actually as important as what did work. And then finally, there's this lack of exemplars, and that's the reason we're on this mission of talking about it. It's the reason we ran the special issue of computational science. It's the reason we had talks at Supercomputing. We think that we need more examples of where people have been doing what to date has been accidental translationism, and then ultimately good feedback so that people can see what does work and what doesn't work. Funding, as I mentioned before, it's not just a question of more money, it's the variety of money that we need. Obviously, more money would be nice, but it's changing the way that money can be applied. So if you need to build translation into the research plan, then you need funding items in a budget that allow you to do that. And so that interaction with the end users is often incredibly expensive and time consuming, and it needs to be fed back in. And as I said a moment ago, the venues, the metrics and reward structures need to be rethought as well. So when you're promoting somebody or a tenure track committee or something like that, it shouldn't just be that they've got so many tier 1 publications, but maybe they spent a good deal of their time actually engaging with the community and applying something and feeding it back in. In medicine, there are now journals of translational medicine, and then some other impact factors that would allow someone to put those on their CV would be the sort of thing that could feed back in and in fact create more people who are doing this in the first place. We think there's a need to integrate this into the training programs, and so modifying our doctoral training programs and the like, and even the undergraduate programs to feed it back in would in fact allow more people to know about it. And look, I just want to spend a few minutes now talking about the hacks, if you like, as to how people have made this work. And here's an example going back to the Nimrod work I mentioned before, and how we in fact managed to do it. Because one of the things that allows you to get around many of those roadblocks is by living in a lab which is big enough. So it turns out the scale of the laboratory actually matters. So all of the tools in the middle that were built in the lab I was running at the time, they bled across each other. And so whilst one group might be working more on the core algorithms, another group can be working with the user communities, possibly funded by a different funding mechanism. And these things contribute and bleed together. If you're the only researcher in your lab working on one problem, it's very hard to do the research, the publications, the deployment, the user engagement, all of those things. More people, possibly funded on different schemes, means that you can start to do more of those things. So we engaged with every major faculty of the university at the time. We engaged with a number of external research collaborators. We actually spun out 2 startups and had multiple industry funding sources there. And there's no way you can do that with only 1 or 2 people. Another thing we did by scale was leverage an international network of people working, in this case, across the Pacific Rim. So this is an NSF-funded activity that was started by Peter Artsberger and Phil Papadopoulos and some other people in the US that engaged communities across the Pacific Rim. And so the work I showed you before, doing the Savannah modeling, was done on the PRAGMA testbed. So I didn't have to build the PRAGMA testbed. We contributed some computers. We actually used NSF-supported software across those machines, and different partners contributed their resources so that we could do an experiment of scale across the testbed of scale. Now, we couldn't have done that on our own, but the scale of PRAGMA, with multiple partners all leveraging their local funding agencies, allowed us to build a much bigger thing and learn a lot about the translation of that in the process. So the PRAGMA testbed was used for the Savannah burn work. And the graphs, you don't have to read, show the activity of time, but the elapsed time from the beginning of that experiment to the end was 6 months. In the meantime, we'd moved data across the international networks. We'd worked out what didn't work in our scheduling algorithms. As I told you, we reworked them over the long period. We also built a social network across that community that allowed us to do some additional things, like sending undergraduate students as research interns abroad. And so every year prior to COVID, we were sending a small number of students across our summer or your winter time to engage with an international colleague, a mentor, on the research project. And so it was not uncommon for us to take a big project and use the students to help do the translation. Here's an example of a group we sent to a person from UCSD who came to Australia, who was working on cardiac modeling. So the interdisciplinary science was bioengineering, but they applied Nimrod to solve that problem. So when the student came out, they joined our group, applied Nimrod, and then were able to take that back into UCSD to finish their degree. So you've got students moving across that international boundary, and it's a lot of the translation that occurred because a small amount of additional effort by that undergraduate student was enough to do the translational bit of the research. We ran a lot of seminars across that, and people laugh now when I say we were running international seminars across the Pacific in real time. Since COVID, of course, that's become the norm. And we would regularly send students across here to supercomputing, and unfortunately we haven't done that since COVID. Maybe next year we'll be able to kickstart that again, of bringing groups of, in fact, high school students and dropping them in the show floor at supercomputing and saying, go away and see what you think about this. So that was also some experience. So I'm going to finish now and just leave a few minutes for questions. But again, speaking at the Kennedy Institute and having won the Kennedy Award in Ken's name, I just want to tie it back to the things that I know he was doing were very much in this ilk of translational computer science. So formalizing it seems to be a totally appropriate thing to do. If you want something a little bit lighter, go and read my novel called Purely Academic, which is a novelized version of the play I produced a few years back that tells you all the bad habits that PhD students shouldn't get into. So look that one up on Amazon. And I'll finish with nothing to do with computer science and pictures of my stained glass windows that I make in my spare time. And John, if there's a way to do questions, we've got something like 8 or 9 minutes or something, so I'm happy to do that now.
Thank you, David, for a very stimulating talk. So as the one holding the mic first, I'll take the opportunity to offer the first comment. So it's interesting that as part of the exascale computing project that they have been focused on actually forced translations. So in what they're doing is they're taking the teams that are working on various software products and then forcing us to integrate with other teams. And so my team is working on performance tools, and in order to show the values of our tools, we're being forced to work with groups who are working on problems in quantum chemistry and plasma physics and whatnot, and actually show the value of what we're building for what they're doing, and then take what we experience in working with these different computational groups and then feed that back into, that's the red feedback loop that you were talking about, which is look at what they're actually trying to do, deciding whether we're actually able to do what they would like in the best possible way, and then make some changes to what we're doing to kind of better service working with these application teams. But I think also something that's a big challenge is the software sustainability. And so there have been some initiatives from the National Science Foundation, the Software Sustainability Initiatives, and they had some ways of measuring that, where when we had one of these grants funded, they would ask us to count the publications per year, not just of things that we were publishing, but of things that were leveraging our work. So it was like papers that are citing our work where they're either building on top of it or they're using our software or things like that. So that's an effort to try and come up with some metrics by which they could gauge our impact. And then to bring this back to the exascale computing project, I think one of the big concerns is they've now spent, they're fixing to spend $1 billion on the software for these DOE exascale systems. So what happens when the project's over? They have $1 billion worth of software that's going to start rotting the next day as interfaces change, as the vendors upgrade the operating system and things like that. And so the concern is, how do we sustain software if it's not being commercialized and there isn't, an external source of revenue coming in? I'd be interested to hear if you have any thoughts about how to actually provide software sustainability if it's not being commercialized.
Yeah, that's a great question at the end, but the comments earlier up, I completely agree, and I certainly don't want to give the impression that nothing's happening, because, as you say, a lot of these ideas, lots of people have been talking about this for a while, and they're being integrated into the things that are happening. On that sort of forced translation stuff, all I'd say is it's just not easy, is it?
No, it's not.
It adds a step of complexity there. The software maintenance problem is absolutely a problem, and I actually don't have an answer. I know I've written lots of research proposals where we promised that the thing would be maintained, and we haven't got a clue how to do that, right? I mean, at the end of the day, unless someone puts this is thermodynamics, right? It's unless someone puts continued energy into the system, it's just entropy will win out, and it'll just rot away, as you say. So it's hard to imagine that you can do it without putting effort in. And what we always do is our next project is the one that tries to sort of maintain the last one as well, whilst moving forward. But I think entropy rules. So I don't have an answer to that other than someone has to pay for it. And, even when people talk about things like Linux and open source software and whatever else, when you stand back objectively and say, so who is maintaining that? It's people who are by and large employed by governments. I mean, obviously there's the commercial stuff, which is getting maintained as well, but there's an awful lot of government funding that actually goes into those projects to keep them alive. So I don't have an answer, I'm sorry, other than it's going to continue to cost money, and maybe we just have to recognize that it is going to cost money to keep these things alive. The real question is which ones we want to keep alive, I suppose.
Right, and so I think that's something that we're seeing with the Department of Energy, where they're now actually thinking about having some sort of software sustainability project. They used to say, we just fund research, and now they're actually trying to think about what they're going to do with this $1 billion worth of software. So I'd be happy to take around the mic to let other people ask questions.
Hi, David. This is Angela Wilkins. We were emailing earlier. I wish you could have been here today. It was, it's a really great talk. I spend a lot of time talking to industry on, as part of the Institute and part of Rice's behalf. And I always see they want their students to come in with these translational skills immediately. Have you ever seen a mechanism where they can actually be helpful, whether or not they give time or money, or, because, NVIDIA says they want this, but what can I do to get them to help?
It's a great question. And I think there's a more general version of that, which the industry always wants industry-ready students anyway, right? Whether it's translation or whatever else. My off the top of my head thoughts would be that if you build translation into the research that you're training students in the first place, then they're going to pick up some of those skills. So the students that I mentioned very briefly at the end there that we'd moved across the international boundaries with internship schemes, we're doing translational research. We weren't calling it then because we hadn't kind of invented the term. But I'd like to think that when they go out into industry, they will have at least engaged in that whole idea of doing research in context in a more way. If the research partner themselves funded that research as part of their research funding and it was translational, then again, you'd be getting students going out with more of those skills. So I think if we fix things up so that translation is possible and understood, then we're probably going to generate more students who are translation ready. And the whole thing might just feed back in a positive way.
So I need to get NVIDIA to complain to the government.
No, I think NVIDIA, so the first question is, does NVIDIA fund research in the lab? Probably yes. Well,
some they send me GPUs instead of money.
Yeah, so that's a problem in its first, right? Because I think if NVIDIA were, and look, there's lots of examples where industry does invest in the research. So then it's a question of doing it in such a way that it's translational. So the students who are then involved in that lab are going back out with those skills. If they're not even funding the research in the first place, then you're going and telling the government to do it never kind of works out too well, does it? So I think, but we have in Australia some research grants. Actually, this is one area where we have got a good structure. Is a thing called linkage grants, and these are research grants that industry is engaged in and have to put dollars into as well as the government. They're not translational in themselves, but they could be. And so I think the first step is industry involvement in research and then making it translational. Or if you're doing translational research, then industry's hiring those people, and maybe then they'll realize there's value in feeding back in. So this is a long game. We'll play it for a while, I think.
Okay, I'm going to take the microphone across the room, but along the way, as I move, I'll say that actually the state of Texas had an innovation program that they funded probably 20 years ago, where it was partnerships between the university doing research, and you had to have an industrial partner that was signing on kind of as a sponsor for the whole thing, as an interested consumer. So an attempt to try and do that, we don't do that anymore in Texas.
Interesting.
Hi, Joe Cavallero in Electrical and Computer Engineering. Enjoyed your talk. We're supposed to have lunch tomorrow, but unfortunately. So my question was on this idea of a translation. So in the projects I'm involved in, which are more hardware-based, communications hardware, we're interested in reproducibility, and we have some government test beds where we're trying to have a center at University of Utah that people can access remotely. So this idea of translation becomes rather difficult when you're trying to have hardware, specialized communications hardware, cellular hardware, that people can access over the web remotely, to be able to keep the tools up to date, to have like Docker images that have the correct version. So if you go outside of the domain, like some of the domains you talked about that have some external hardware or some high performance computing driving hardware, how do you see that we get people interested and involved? The challenge is getting people to want to use this weird test bed with weird software that is being created. So how do we get people more excited about this kind of community test bed?
So that's kind of a complicated question, because so let me just start by saying that I don't see any intrinsic reason why you wouldn't be doing translational research in a hardware domain or something that involved a distinct artifact. So the point being that you're trying to apply the stuff and measure and feed it back into the research process. So I think the fact that it's a test bed is kind of a slightly different angle on it. But the question is, how do you get people to use those test beds? Well, the PRAGMA test bed was a bit like that, in that we each partner put things in and we collaborated around it. They were supporting their own ends out of their research projects. So when someone put something into the test bed, they were responsible for actually providing the support for that. It didn't survive in terms of, when you talk about sustainability and longevity, it didn't. It's no longer operational. So I can't tell you how to do that, but I think that's tied up with John's question earlier about sustainability. But I'm not quite sure I see that it's intrinsically a translational problem. I think you can do it.
Okay, thank you. I think it's an organizational problem as much. NSF is putting a lot of resources into these types of wireless test beds and getting industry involvement too, but it's very hard sometimes to get people at different universities to agree on how to go forward and how to bring their results back into the test bed for other people to use.
Right. Okay.